Good old Teams privacy settings for us there. So yes, just a quick reminder of the code of conduct for us all. And thank you to everyone who is being so respectful in the chat from everything that has happened this morning. So good morning. Welcome to the adoption track at the Copilot Community Conference 2026. This is the first session in that adoption track, and I'm going to be talking about skills, not hype, and that pathway to Copilot adoption with confidence. So it's my job this morning, my pleasure, to kick off the adoption track. And I thought I'd start with defining adoption. So what do we mean when we talk about adoption? It's not just turning on the software, giving people the tools. It's not just about giving them training in how to use the product. It's about a concerted effort to help people embrace new workflows, to shift their habits from the way they used to do things to using Copilot or using the new tool. It's about building their confidence in working with that product. It's about looking at the way we do things and considering if there are better ways to do things in the light of these new tools that we have available to us. And it's about setting down the foundations to ensure those changes become constant, they become sustained and embedded into our day-to-day work. For those of you I haven't met before, hi, my name's Sarah. I am an independent Microsoft 365 consultant and trainer. I've been a Microsoft certified trainer for more years than I care to admit. I'm also a nail art and certification badge addict. Like to speak at community events, including these virtual ones. It's lovely to see such a big virtual event up and running again. After we've spent so much time traveling, it's nice to get back to being able to reach people where they are. And as part of my community conference addiction, I am also an MVP and a community lead for Microsoft certified trainers as well. If you want to connect with me or download my slides, which will be available to you after the session, I will post a link to my link tree in the chat, which has all of the relevant links on it. Okay. And as you have seen from the message in the chat, please notice that I will be monitoring the Q&A for questions. I won't be looking at the chat so much as the Q&A. So if you do have questions, please do make sure you post them in there, and I'll review the chat towards the end. So please do use that if you have questions for me. Right, so does this pattern look familiar to you? Hopefully it does. This is the Gartner hype cycle. And this shows the adoption curve, if you like, that we experience quite a lot. We start with the technology, we reach that peak hype where we all want that new technology. We start to use it and realize, not quite going the way I want it to, and we hit that trough of disillusionment. Where the key impact we can have from an adoption scheme comes in is the slope of enlightenment. And we're aiming to reach that productivity plateau by bringing that embedded user confidence into the world of Copilot in our case. Do you know where your organisation is on this slope right now? Because you can't influence adoption unless you know where you're starting. Okay, so you need to know where your organization is. And I would take a bet that for most organizations, you're somewhere between the technology trigger, the peak hype, or the trough of disillusionment. There's some organizations starting to climb that slope of enlightenment. But to be honest, there's such a world of change that we're living in with AI and Copilot that slope of enlightenment is probably quite a slippery slope. We'll climb it, and then Microsoft will release new features, and we'll slide back down with the new features to climb back up again as we get used to all those features. So it becomes a little bit more of a cycle. I'm sure you've all met our wonderful little mascot for the event, Coco. For today, Coco is playing my enthusiastic adopter. And to preserve the privacy of the people I've worked with in the past, what I've done is I've embedded Coco with some characteristics and given Coco some messages to send to match what people have told me in the past. So changes have been named to protect the innocent, shall we say. And Coco is playing the head of HR at an organisation of around 500 people. Now, Coco as head of HR has been lobbying to get Microsoft 365 Copilot for months. Okay, I'm very, very excited to have this product and to get working with it. And so day one, they hear they've got Copilot. Microsoft 365 Copilot licenses have been assigned. So here we go, full enthusiasm. I have the full Copilot. This is going to change absolutely everything. I'm really excited. And even though it's the end of the working day, 20 to 6 in the evening, you can see that message was sent. So later that same day, we're definitely at peak hype here. I mean, we're working out of hours, 11 o'clock in the evening, sending messages out of hours. I'm just so excited. I've been playing for ages, creating meeting agendas, all sorts of different things, including this wonderful poster. Anyone spot the problem? Monday's not the 26th of April, and we probably wouldn't start an away day at 9 p.m. in the evening. So unfortunately, even though Coco is still very, very excited, they are running into some things that they need to fact check on their content that they're producing. So we've got some usage issues here. And then a few days later, we follow up with Coco after that brilliant excitement, and we found that they've hit the trough. They're pretty frustrated. All of the content they're generating it's not living up to expectations. There's some challenges with it. It's pulling the wrong files. It's pulling in errors like Monday, the 26th of April, at 9 p.m. instead of 9 a.m. And our user is now doubting. They are lacking in confidence. They doubt in the product. They doubt in their skills. This is not Coco's failure. This is an adoption failure. They were set up to fail. Okay, they were not given the skills that they needed to do the job they set out to do. And we know this anecdotally, anyone involved in any kind of adoption will have seen this many times over. But let's not just take anecdotal evidence. Let's look at studies, research, and facts into this. So I've included all of the links for the studies that I referenced, not just that Copilot referenced for me, but that I went and checked and confirmed the details, because you always fact check your results. But 63% of AI adoption or AI implementation failures are due to the human in the loop, not the technology. Okay, human failures cause over half of the product and implementation failures. And a large proportion of those stem from proficiency gaps, yet they were still trained. So if 38% of the failures stem from proficiency gaps, but only 6% of those 38 didn't get training or support, then the training and support's not working. Okay, that's what we learn. What we learn from these numbers is it's not about putting in place some form of support. It's about putting in place the right support. And when it works, when you combine skills training with full adoption and behavior change support, then you get the rapid climb out of that trough into a productivity plateau where you are starting to see rapid increase in the use of the tools, rapid return of confidence and enthusiasm in the product, which drives deeper adoption going forward. And the statistics you've got on the second half of this slide are all from studies of adoption implementation projects that were successful. So, what makes an adoption process successful? Well, let's have a look. What do you think? Let me put this link in the chat for you as well. So I've got a form running. Hopefully it's still running live. You know, after all these technology challenges this morning, you never know what's going to happen. But hopefully it's all still playing out. And everyone can see that. What we're seeing, what I'm asking you here is, got to pick one. You can only pick one, but what's the best option to give users these skills? Come on, forms updates. Yay, technology working. Okay, peer support is coming out top at the moment. Oh, hands-on. Okay, peer support's back at the top. Oh, we're even now. Instructor-led starting to creep back up at the bottom there. Okay. Not a lot of love for some of the others. The other options that we had there, the self-paced learning modules, they're getting no love whatsoever. No one thinks of that. And the written guides, videos are tough because videos get out of date so quickly. Okay, so we're going, it appears, with the hands-on practice followed by peer support. And that's a great comment. Where is the option for a mixture? Giving away my ideas. There you go. There's a true classroom tip. You always get someone who cracks the joke before you can. And the reason you don't have a mixture of all option on this form is one of the key failures that people make when they design their adoption programs. They say, which one of these are we going to do? And they do one. But you're exactly right. There is no one true way. Okay. People have different learning styles. We have different scheduling demands, especially in the world in which we work in. One of the reasons AI is so popular is because it promises time savings. Okay. People have priorities that they need to balance, and they need to schedule different things into their day. They also have different abilities, different starting points, different requirements. They have the background that they work in. If we're a large international organization, we have a lot of different cultural influences and geographic influences on the way in which people learn and the way in which we can schedule any kind of skilling for them, and how we can reach them and who can reach them even. And then we have a whole different lot of job roles. To meet all of these needs, we need a mixture. Exactly as you said, we need that balance of approach that addresses all of these with a multimodal or multiple modes of skilling deployed. One thing that is constant, though, people learn with repetition. Okay, doesn't matter which technique you use to give them information, we need to hear things more than once for it to stick. And if we use multiple different modes and build it into a pathway or a full adoption program, then we get repetition that isn't or doesn't feel like repetition. So we get to repeat the learning without repeating the activity. So a skills pathway isn't tied to a single adoption framework. And I've deliberately tried to not focus in on any single framework of adoption or methodology in this session, because there's some great sessions throughout the rest of this track that look at how some of those different frameworks can be applied to Copilot adoption. Okay, so what I'm looking at with this framework should work with whatever adoption methodology you want to choose to guide you through the project. And I'm drawing on proven experience of adoption across multiple products, but especially across Copilot, and giving you a pathway to follow of steps, of techniques that you can use to help embed confidence skills into your users. And this is my pathway, okay? It's nothing groundbreaking. It's nothing completely new. You will recognize most of the steps in this pathway from other methodologies that you've seen, that you've used, projects you've been involved in. But please make sure that you complete something in each of these steps. Now let's jump in and look at them in a bit more detail. Skills gap analysis. We are trying to give people skills to use the tools, but it's no good teaching them skills they already know. Okay. If I spend all of my time talking about things that people already know, they're going to switch off really quickly. We need to make sure we focus in on what they need. So my preferred method is define the desired outcomes. Identify the existing skills that users have and any constraints that we have towards how we can upskill. With those three pieces of information, we can start identifying which skills that are in that gap and our desired skill levels that we can address, and we can design methodologies to get there. Okay. Different factors, different ways of doing this. I quite like the comfort factor, asking users how comfortable they are with a particular skill, task, activity. It doesn't feel challenging to them, that we're not negating their current knowledge or judging them. And that's again a really important factor when you're analysing techniques, skills, abilities. We need to get people to be really honest with us. So they need to feel comfortable and trusting of the process. Okay. However you decide to capture those existing skills, you do need to combine it with where you want to get to and the restrictions, as I say, on what you can do and how to get there. And that might be financial, it might be scheduling, it might be cultural. We then go on and design the skilling. So we've got a nice committee here working together on designing different types of training materials, different skilling artifacts, if you like. And we want to make sure this is multimodal. So we've got paper, we've got digital, we've got video showcased in this image. So we need to include those different options. And that also gives us the opportunity to build in accessibility into what we're doing, because those barriers that we have, those constraints, may be in people's physical and emotional and mental needs to support their skilling as well. Okay, so you need to think about how those different modes are going to transfer across. Okay. Then we need to start by setting a baseline. Everyone thinks that they have the baseline knowledge and they will always skip baseline or introductory level sessions. So you've got the challenge of, do you make them mandatory? But this baseline session needs to set that minimum standard to access the upskilling. And it should be mandatory for everyone. It should be something that is accessible to everyone, but not off-putting to people who do have those really high level skills. So again, this is where the multi-modes can come in. And it could be that you do an instructor-led session, you have videos, you have communication guides, you have user guides, you maybe have it gated at the end with some kind of assessment, some kind of quiz, perhaps, to say, yes, you've completed the mandatory training, even if people have only reviewed the communication explaining the principles and the aims and objectives of the adoption that we're in. So that introductory step is really important, but you need to work hard to make sure it's not off-putting to our users, from both those who need a lot of help adopting the AI technologies and the tools we're bringing in, to those who actually probably know as much, if not more, than the person who would be delivering the training. We don't want to alienate any of those people in our process. And then we get to the exciting bit. Anyone who delivers any kind of training or works on any kind of adoption process probably relishes the challenge of doing the stretch training, the in-depth pieces as well, and bringing those through into the program. Unfortunately, it is an area that a lot of people tend to want to cut down on. Organizations don't have the money to invest in adoption where there's a lot of customization needed. And this is where that stretch training really comes in. So we can build exercises, guided activities, reflective activities, things that force people to take the basics that they've learnt and stretch themselves into applying those skills. That's where we're really looking. Can they apply those skills? Okay. And actually, this brings us back full circle to that design, that analysis. When you're doing this analysis, what other types of information can you gather? You can gather information that relates to the kinds of tasks people do day to day, the kind of activities where they want to use AI to help them. And we've got a question in the Q&A asking any other tips for doing that skills gap analysis that isn't another survey. Well, there's different ways of looking at it, and it depends on the size of your cohort to a large extent. I think you can think about not asking people what their skills are, but what would they like to learn how to do with AI? That's one way of seeing where they don't feel confidence and where they think the technology is. You can read a lot from that. And asking people not to rate themselves, but to suggest ideas can also help you then analyze that and identify where their skills lie. And actually using Copilot to analyze those results, those feedback, those comments, is a great way to try and identify those features as well. So try and be creative in how you ask. It has to be some form of survey, unless you can get people in a room or set them some kind of test, which they're not going to like. But if you can be creative around how you do it and use multiple methods, again, you're going to get a much richer set of information. Some people will engage with one type, some people will engage with another. Okay, so that's something that you need to be as multimodal about as with everything else. Okay. And as we get the in-depth information, this is also where we can start to engage the rest of our community. We can bring people into that skills gap analysis piece from different parts of the business to inform what they want their team, what they think their team, what they think their department will use the technology for, what they need to learn. And that drives us then into that reinforcement part. Okay, because now what we're doing is we're now building up with the knowledge that we have in the business, with what they've learnt, coming back and asking additional questions, fulfilling additional gaps that we're identifying. This is where we get the one member of the team going on and helping the others, becoming a community champion. Whether you nominate them as that or not, they evolve naturally in the business. The one user who you go to when you've got an Excel problem, the one colleague that you always ask about Teams challenges, they evolve naturally in your organization. So we can take advantage of that, as well as running formal sessions around the adoption process, such as troubleshooting sessions. We don't have to bill any of these as training. Okay. how you market the skilling to our users is also part of the challenge. We need to bring people in and get them engaged with the sessions, and marketing it just as another training webinar doesn't always help. So you're multimodal in everything you do through adoption. How you deliver skills, how you gather that information, how you market your adoption program, and how you pull that information in from others in the team. So this email I've rebadged under Co, but this is almost a direct quote. I've changed a couple of bits so I don't give away the actual users, but this is almost a direct quote from a customer who went through an adoption process. And basically, after participating in this adoption program, which is very similar to the 200 user program I'm going to show you in a second, I got feedback from a customer talking about how much more confident they felt. This was a very simple adoption process that was very low cost and actually not as multimodal as we would have liked, but it still produced good results. And my fictional HR my head of HR, played by Coco here, was actually really happy with their own personal skilling journey. And if you want to read this in full, you can obviously download the slides, but they were then asking for additional skilling. You can tell it's relatively new because they're mentioning Copilot Co-work, already engaging in learning about what's coming soon. Which brings us to the final step. Okay. Review and refresh. The world of Copilot is not standing still, in case you hadn't noticed. It changes every day. I mean, I lose track of the number of times I go to demonstrate a feature and, it's changed again. Okay, what's it doing today? So now that we know that we've got our users on our path of adoption and they're working their way up their slope, we need to keep an eye on what we're doing and how we're going to support those new features going forward. In fact, we almost need to rerun the whole process again and again and again and again to keep refreshing, adding updated assets for people to go back to, adding new assets about new features, again, keeping that multimodal approach in the process, doing top-ups, carrying on running sessions that allow people to share their knowledge or giving them mechanisms to share their experience going forward. Okay, some of the things like edit with Copilot, allow editing, or agent mode is a simple message. We can convey things like that when those changes come around with simple messaging to users. But Copilot Co-work, that's maybe going to need something a little bit more in depth as we roll that out to our users. And that starts with our own skilling. So we as adoption specialists, we as trainers, we as the people conveying those skills, need to move people into that technology. So we've got a question asking about, well, why are we still talking about prompts and prompt training when we should be building a full framework as to how to use these things naturally? And I think you have to consider meeting your users where they are. That idea of evaluating their current level and see it as a stepping stone. So ignoring this 200 user sample program that I've just put on the screen at the moment, but it feeds into it. I've just designed a slightly larger program for a 4,000 user organization, and they are looking at doing training in this next 6 months on Copilot in each of the apps. Copilot in Word, Copilot in Excel, Copilot in PowerPoint, because we're setting that baseline level of knowledge so that when we bring co-work on top, they're taking the knowledge of what they can do in the individual products into the product that can span everything. So you've got to think about, how do you climb the slope in steps that are comfortable? Most people can't ski uphill. Okay, so if I give them a smooth slope to go up, it's more challenging. So I have to give them steps. So prompting is a great first step for people who feel that the prompt is their challenge to accessing the product. Then we can start thinking about, okay, so how do I use those prompts to convey the task I'm trying to do? How do I build this into the day-to-day, my day-to-day? But you've got to teach them to walk before you can teach them to run. And in fact, we're probably trying to teach them to stand. And then we can teach them to walk, and then we can teach them to run. And something those of us who are immersed in a technology tend to forget is just how daunting and challenging those first few steps can be, especially for people who don't like technology, who don't find it interesting and exciting, who see that hype cycle as just another reason to take a deep sigh and think, oh, those tech nerds, they're at it again. We've got to encourage, enthuse, entertain, and instruct through this program. So I was asked to do a training program for a 200 user law firm. Okay, roughly 200. Okay, and we were given very, very little time and very little funding to do the program. So we made heavy use of the materials on the Microsoft Adoption site with minimal customization. Okay, and that email I just showed you from Coco came from a very similar project with a 500 user organization who put similar amount of money in and just threw more people onto the different sessions. So a mandatory 90-minute webinar giving them the basics of how to navigate around and doing those basic prompts. The Copilot Quick Start Guide, 10 try first. We did get permission to build a workbook which had customized exercises in it, but then also pointed them to the scenario library on the adoption site, and also gave them this Copilot channel in every team, so that in every department level team, so that they could share their ideas and successes. And during that second week, we had experts dropping into those channels to drop ideas from the workbook in, and suggestions as to how they could do things and answering questions. Then the final week was them running through a checklist to say that they'd done all the prep steps from our quick start guides, and then a couple of drop-in sessions for additional questions, and then a survey. And then we got that feedback about following up with additional sessions, going deeper. This is what it might look like if you're doing a larger scale organization. This was much more in depth for 1,000 users. This scales up quite well with multiple, with larger organizations as well. and splits over several months. So we've got webinars happening in one of the months, okay, in month 1. We've got then that building that muscle memory, building that standard usage, building it into every day by forcing them, by mandating them to set scheduled prompts or running prompts regularly. No, we can't enforce that, but by giving that impression, we're starting to build that memory. Okay. And also, again, that departmental or team level communication around Copilot usage and adoption and what works and what doesn't work. And that, as MVPs, is also a very valuable resource because it gives us a lot of information that we can collate and share back when we're giving feedback to Microsoft as well. And also for a lot of large organizations who have that direct relationship, they can use that in that same way. And then finally, the review phase where we're asking them to complete the next step survey. So what do they want next? Not how did it go? What do you want? What can we give you next? So that it's self-serving for the users to fill in that feature. And of course, we've got multiple modalities in there as well. If you're going to design your own pathway, there are 3 key questions you need to define before you can design the structure of any kind of adoption project, regardless of your methodology. How will you define whether or not your adoption project has been successful? What can you measure? Is it number of prompts used? Is it number of active users? Is it the vibrancy of your Teams chats and your virtual Copilot community? Is it how many of your users attend Co? What is going to be your success metric? Okay. You need to know where you're starting. It doesn't have to be very defined, but maybe ask one person from each department. Are you using Copilot? How do you feel about it? Just that quick personal conversation can really help you get that definition of where you're starting. And then use those different modes without a multimodal approach. Things that feel like training, things that don't feel like training, things that feel like they're personalized and tailored and supportive. That's how we're going to get more of our users into the product and have a successful adoption process for Copilot. Is any of this new and rocket science? No, this is standard adoption, but we do have a very helpful assistant in all of this. We can use Copilot to help us define our success metrics, to identify how we can measure those, to help us write these different materials. Though do watch out, because Copilot is brilliant at writing you exercises that you can't actually do. That the steps are all wrong. So you do need to validate them all. But some of those ideas, some of that ideation piece, that is an absolute godsend when you're working with the tool. Okay. And I would also strongly suggest that you look at the comments in the chat in this meeting. Apologies to people who are watching it as a video and can't see the scrolling comments, but we've got things that are being added in there that are really useful, like giving people the opportunity to transfer their skills into their functional area. People don't have the vision a lot of the time, or even the time and brain power to make that jump, that reflective piece. We go back to our reflection, our reinforcement step here, to reflect on what they're doing and adapt it into their own day-to-day work. They just don't see that. Yeah. And the other comment that we've got here about the basics, making sure that we are designing that introductory training to address those basic levels. Most of us do not realize when we are missing basics. We don't know what we don't know. We cannot ask for things that we don't know. We've also got a recommendation to look at the EU Digital Competency Framework to help with that skilling analysis. That's that skill gap analysis piece in there. And there are a lot of useful tools like that out there as well. We've already mentioned the comment that prompt training is an interim step. Completely agree, and that needs to be something that we work on how we're going to map that out. Okay. Notice that people who are good at delegating to others are very good at working with AI. Yes, they should be the people that we're pulling in to help us do that identification and that skilling design, especially because they will be the ones who are good at prompting and designing the techniques in there. Okay, so that was the skilling pathway that I wanted to share with you today and pull that through. Let me just have a look, see if there's any other questions. Oh, what are the most effective metrics to measure success? To be honest, the most effective metric to measure success of an adoption project is what is the difference between use before and what is the difference with use after. Okay. And that will boil down to the number of prompts. I personally would like to see a minimum of a 200% increase in the number of prompts that are used in the amongst our cohorts on a day-to-day basis, as an absolute minimum, as a benchmark for success. We did have the metric here, 475% increase in Copilot usage. But I'd be looking longer term than the 16 days to see that that success factor as you get things moving through. Okay. So we're coming towards time. I did mention right at the start that you're welcome to connect with me and download the deck. You're welcome to connect. As I say, you will also find a PDF of the deck in there. Does anyone have any other questions? I can see one already. How will we measure if the prompts are effectiveness or not if we were measuring the number of prompts? If people keep coming back and keep using the product, they are getting value from it themselves. Measuring the quality of the output is a bit more of a challenging statement and task. I would like to see some form of metric as to how long the conversation goes on for, not just one prompt and a response. I'd like to see those conversations continuing. You can also encourage users to ask Copilot to evaluate their different their different use cases. So obviously we're all starting to explore co-work, and one of the things I found really useful is asking at the end for co-work to evaluate, to critique my co-work session, and what other Copilot tools could I have used or should I have used instead of co-work, or that I could now use to extend this task further. So some kind of evaluation of what you're doing is incredibly helpful as well for the users. Everyone needs at least 2 minutes to move between sessions. So I'm going to thank you all for attending this session. I think next up is Edita with 12 lessons from 12 months in the field. And I personally can definitely recommend this session. I've seen it earlier. I'm sure it's evolved, but I've seen this session and it's absolutely brilliant. So I do hope you stay on for Edita's session.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much.
So much for being part of the Copilot Community Conference. Very interesting to follow your session. Great comment there. So thank you so much also to the attendees to being interactive, asking questions. Very good to see that.
Indeed.
A question from my side, Sarah. So I'm not sure if you are working also internationally or not, but perhaps you have. Of course, I'm pretty sure that you have UK companies which are spreading over the world. And do you see any differences between users working in the UK, in Europe, or in other regions of the world when we talk about adoption and Copilot?
There are differences. Yes, you do need to be aware of cultural differences around the world as you're designing your training, and it's something to bring in, especially when we're thinking data security. There are very different appetites, concerns when we address data security around Copilot in the different parts of the world. That tends to be the biggest cultural difference at the moment that we're observing, especially with the whole Anthropic question in the EU at the moment.
Yes, Microsoft.
And associated.
Yes, Microsoft is always a surprise for us.
Always.
Yeah, always. Every day it's new learning and new user adoption, of course, too.
Yes, but that's also why I mentioned the constraints at the start, because those cultural and geographic constraints are something that we do need to take into account as we're pulling the adoption process together and our design of it. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Switching now.